For those of you who don't know, the wine industry right now is going through a major reset. And by reset, we mean decline. Now, there's two schools of thought on this. One is that this is a temporary blip where it's a natural cycle of a little bit of overproduction, underconsumption, and that will flatten itself out over the next couple of years and be back to the long-term growth trend over the past 50 years. The other school of thought is that this is a structural decline, that there are things happening beyond the short-term wildfires, climate risks, water stress, labor stress that are going on that are pointing to something a little bit deeper. That's the point that I'm trying to make in my latest time-setting essay, Beyond the Wine Industry's Great Gen X Reset. So let's get into it right now. All right, what you're looking at here is my latest essay on jasonvoiovich.com. Click on the time setting button on the homepage and go to the wine industry reset to learn more. I will be walking through this today. I'm not going to read all of it, obviously, for you, but I want to hit the high points to basically help you understand how I came to the conclusion that the wine industry is in a structural reset based on the time and timing aspects at play, and what the industry should be thinking about as it looks to reinvent and rethink itself. So let's go into just a little bit of detail right now. Before we kind of talk about where the wine industry is today, we sort of need to understand how it got here. And over the past 50 years now, bluntly, humans have been making wine for thousands of years, but we're going to focus in on the California area over the past 50 years. And why would I do that? It's because of an event in 1976 called, named the Judgment of Paris. And essentially it was a blind taste test in France where California wines, two in particular, did spectacularly well and really put California on the global map for wine production. After that, there's been a series of key events that have happened over the past 50 years that have been driving the industry forward almost without pause. Back in 1981, a few years after that, obviously California is now on the map. The U.S. government recognized Napa Valley as California's first AVA, American Viticultural Area. Now, if any of these terms seem weird, in the essay, I've got this vintners glossary where you can click on this and talk about, okay, what is a vintner? What is a trellis? What is crush? What is grubbing? All of those sort of terms, or if you're like, I have no idea, you could go here and take a look. I am not going to get into oaky notes with a cinnamon finish or anything like that. I'm not a huge, I love wine, but I'm not into wine, if you know what I mean. So if that's you, and that's like most of us, you might need a little bit of this information, but it's okay. So you can skip this if you are a grower and you're looking at this. You already know all that stuff. That's why I hid it in this tray, because not most growers don't need to see that. Okay, we created the AVA in 1981. From 1989 to 1998, there was the first major challenge in this kind of general upward trend, and it's phylloxera, and basically a little bug. It wiped out a whole bunch of wine roots, and the California vineyards needed to replant and do a lot of work. Now, basically what that forced them to do, because demand was still going up, vintners had the money they needed to make these infrastructure improvements, modernize practices, everything that needed to happen during that time. There was enough cash floating around where they could do that. Yes, some vintners went out of business during that time. It was not an easy time, but that was the whole idea behind creative destruction, where old practices were put off to the side and new ones came in. The next big issue, though, and why was there so much money sloshing around in the wine industry? Because, and I actually saw this when it came out. I was, let's not say how old I was when I watched this. I wasn't exactly the target market, but I remember watching it. It was a 60 Minutes broadcast called The French Paradox. And Basically, it was a little sketchy science on how French people tended to live longer, and one of the factors was they drank a lot of red wine. Well, it didn't take much for people like my parents and probably yours to say, that's a good enough reason for me, kids. And they started drinking more wine than ever. Again, that surged demand right at the same time. There was a real need to have the money around to redo a lot of these vineyards that were a little bit old and were at risk. So, a couple of other events in the 2000s, the Sideways movie, can talk about that. You started to see in 2014, 2024, some pressure coming in. And 2014 is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in California, which is really responding to groundwater stress. Now, if you know anything about out west in the United States, that entire area is it's basically a desert, and groundwater and using enough water for agriculture and all the people who live there is a constant sort of source of stress of water coming off the Rocky Mountains. I'm not going to get into that here, but know that it's a big deal, and the SGMA was meant to begin to address that. There have been wildfires, major wildfire seasons in 2017 and 2020, and that is leading years later to what the wine industry is calling the Great Reset. And that is, we'll see that happen right here. This chart shows crush volume, basically the amount of wines that are put into wine production, the amount of grapes that are put into wine production, and the average price per ton. You'll notice that over the past 50 years, since the Judgment of Paris, crush volume has pretty much gone up all the time and then started to trail off as we got into 2020, 2025. And the idea behind that is that these environmental pressures have pushed volume down, and therefore, less supply, more demand, the price goes up. Basic Economics 101. And for most people, that's where the analysis stops. It's that, okay, we have all of these environmental factors. There's this sort of quasi-religious aspect to that you sometimes see in climate narrative that is all about this comeuppance for all of these bad practices up to this point, and you're finally getting yours. Again, if you stop there and you stop your analysis at that point, you're missing things, and we need to explore more than just this timeline. We need to explore other timelines in here. So this chart, there's a lot more detail in here. We can go quickly through some of these factors, and I wanted to hit these in the essay about what I call kind of red herrings. All of these input costs, they are significant. And if any growers are listening to this, and I suspect you are, I am not minimizing that in any sense. Labor costs, overtime laws are making a huge impact on profitability. They're making it harder and harder and harder at the same time that demand seems to be falling off. They are making it harder to be profitable in production. Water scarcity, SGMA compliance is a big deal, and that's getting harder and harder each year. When a wildfire comes through, I actually listened to at the Pinot Fest I think it was in Mendocino County a few months ago. The scientists were talking about how wildfire affects the vineyard and at what concentration and for what duration of time wildfire smoke can be above the grapes. How does it get into the grapes, and at what point can you taste it? Really fascinating research. Go check that out if you haven't seen it. I think that's UC Davis. Excellent coverage there, but it doesn't change the fact that at a certain percentage, that wine is garbage. And essentially, it's a total write-off from an insurance perspective, which makes insurance costs go up. Again, at the same time everything else is happening. Regulatory compliance. Here's the deal. When you want to rip out vines, you're really not able in a lot of cases to burn them, which is what we used to do 40, 50, 60 years ago. Now you have to dispose of them differently, which is hugely expensive. So even if you decide you want to reduce your acreage, it's very difficult to actually do that in a cost-effective way. And then finally, all inputs are going up. Fuel, fertilizer, fungicides, equipment, parts, you name it, all costs are going up right at the moment where it is exactly the wrong time for that to happen. So growers, I feel you on this, but, and this is the but, that is not the root cause of what's going on. And I think you get a sense for that already. And some growers I've talked to absolutely understand this already. Others need to get with the program. So let's talk a little bit about what's actually going on. I go through all the detail here, so you can read it if you want to read it. This is the other thing we need to layer onto this. This is kind of a generational look at wine consumption. And this graph and the ones that follow it are critical. Take a look at the difference between baby boomers, Gen X, Millennial, and Gen Z as a proportion of their share of wine volume. Boomers are the biggest, Gen X are second. That difference right there isn't that big of a deal, 41 to 31%. And we'll see that coming up. Because baby boomers are a bigger generation cohort-wise than Gen Xers, the share of wine production, the share of wine consumption, rather, isn't that big of a deal. That's sort of what you would expect. It's, hey, there are more of you, you're a higher proportion. If that were switched, that would be something of note. But that's exactly what you would expect. Here's the problem. Millennials and Gen Z are a much smaller percentage. Now, you might say, okay, well, wait a second. When you're Gen Z, and meaning 18, 19, 20 years old, did you drink a lot of wine? You're probably drinking the cheapest beer you could get. That was certainly me. I didn't really care. I maybe had never even really had a lot of wine other than at a nice dinner that I didn't know what to get. So here is, I'm going to skip down to this chart. This is life cycle trajectory, and it gets at exactly what you're thinking right now, which is, okay, over time, over life cycle of a human being, at least in the United States, between kind of ages 24 and 45, you basically age in to drinking wine. When you're younger, you don't drink a lot of that wine as part of your overall alcoholic consumption. This is obviously people who drink alcoholic beverages. Mostly it's beer and spirits. As you age, life gets fancier. By the time you hit 45, you've kind of aged into drinking a much higher proportion of your alcohol consumption is wine. And that's overall. That's not to say that people who are 45 aren't drinking beer, they're not drinking spirits, absolutely not. But the proportion of wine grows. This is what the wine industry has been banking on for the past 50 years. The issue is this gold line right here. This gold line is saying that millennials are not getting with the fucking program from a wine drinking perspective. They are way behind where Gen Xers and millennials are, because at about age 45, that flattens out. So the problem is that if millennials, the up and coming large generation, are at a flatter line that is half what the boomers and Gen Xers are, that is a structural change in the demand for wine in the United States. Let me say that again for people in the back. That is a structural demographic change that is meaningful, and that is what's going on right now. And point is, okay, well, why now? Why right now? Here, this chart kind of puts it all together. This is California wine trends and the baby boomer demographic wave. Here is the problem. Your peak wine consumption age is between 45 and 75. Baby boomers were born, started in 1946. They are beginning to age out, kind of a euphemism for some are dying off. As you pass 75, you are drinking less wine overall. I don't know a lot of 80, 85-year-olds that are drinking as much as they were when they were 60 or 65. It just doesn't happen that often. There are health reasons for that. There are other age reasons for that. You just don't have the same sorts of issues. Look how the crush volume right here, that's that red line, and the wave of baby boomers seems to pretty much exactly match. This is really the issue. Now, if you think, well, Gen Xers, kind of provide the bridge that will help get to the next phase. Not really. There aren't enough of us. I'm a Gen Xer. There are about 17% fewer of us, and that is driving that down. We're actually the ones as a cohort who are paying $50 to $100 a bottle for wine. So it is helping some of the high-end vineyards make up the gap, but crush volume is going down. The supply is going down to bluntly match demand. It's not that we have input costs are so high that they're artificially driving down supply where there is demand. Demand is dropping. Let me pause on that. Demand for wine is dropping structurally. That's the issue. And until and unless the wine industry addresses that, just solving input cost reductions isn't going to be enough. It is a critical part of that strategy, but it is not enough. In the essay, I walk through a number of different times. This isn't the first time, by the way, that the wine industry has been under pressure. I noted the root-eaten bugs, but that isn't the only one. During Prohibition, for instance, in the 1920s, that an era I've written a lot about, there were lots of different ways that we can think about sacramental wines for religious institutions. There are lots of different ways around the Volstead Act that regulated prohibition. Today, it's all about de-alcoholized wines and shifting to different botanical drinks. There are a lot of different ways that we can do that as a wine industry. Unbundling from the 750 milliliter bottle, we did it during Prohibition. There are different ways to do that, and there are vintners experimenting with different ways to package wines, single serve, alternative formats, kegs, all sorts of different ways to do that could be useful. There's some of the cooperative pooling, asset consolidation for smaller vineyards to kind of group together. Again, during Prohibition, that was key. And then we talked about a number of different cultural issues and some different opportunities, historical lessons that vintners can learn, where hard cider used to be the thing that essentially went away. That Europe and France basically paid vintners to pull wine out. There's just so much wine that was such a glut that wine was cheaper than water in a lot of cases. And then finally, kind of that early jug wine bust in California. And again, different historical eras, different strategic lessons that we can take. The big ones, obviously. Zero proof. What we know about millennials and Gen Z is that they are much more inclined to consume less alcohol for health reasons and other reasons than prior generations. The wine industry needs to address zero proof and low proof versions of their product with the same experience, because millennials and Gen Z want the experience, but don't necessarily want the high alcohol content. Now, keep in mind also, that also helps compete with THC beverages and White Claws and all kinds of other, honestly, crap that's out there. I'm sorry, White Claw folks. You'll never work with me. I think your product is garbage. But I get it that a lot of people like it. I do understand that. Those sort of things are a huge competitor. When I was kind of coming of age into wine, there just weren't that many options. There was beer, scotch, whiskey, spirits, and wine. That was kind of it. Well, now there's THC beverages, there's zero proof, there is mocktails, there's all kinds of stuff. It should not surprise us that millennials and Gen Z, with more choices, the overall consumption of wine is going to be a smaller percentage of that. That is sort of a no-brainer. I think also for vineyards, thinking about agricultural pivots, and that is taking vines out avocados in, vines out agave in, vines out blueberries in, vines out high value table grapes in. Those aren't always easy decisions to make, and there's always a gap between when you pull out productive vineyards and you put in and you grow something new. You have to think about how long does it take to get that new crop to active production. There's some technology that helps do that, but it's the gap is not zero, so you need to be thinking about bridge financing during that time. And then alternative formats, of course. But again, there's some key things to learn in addition to that there are vintners already doing each of those things. What's missing and what should vineyards be thinking about right now? Short payback AgTech, critical. That everything, when you're thinking about an AgTech investment, it is all about time to revenue on that crop. So anything that brings revenue forward is critical, because otherwise you are in bridge financing and that money is costing you money. That seems obvious, but that's what interest is. That is costing you money, costing you revenue during that time. You need to be thinking about anything that is going to accelerate production as quickly as possible. The second thing, thinking about what we learned from fast fashion. The bad side of fast fashion is a lot of garbage clothes ending up in landfills, but the business idea makes sense. You need to be responsive to trends much, 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 much faster than 2 to 3 years for a vintage. 2 to 3 years is way too slow. You need to have options for mixing cocktails or mixing drinks that can respond to a trend you saw on TikTok. Maybe you've got weeks, not years. So you need to be thinking about that loop and operating much faster than we're probably used to operating. Real-time demand sensing, that's just better systems to help really understand what distributors are trying to tell you and what's selling and what's not. Not next year or not 90 days, not 180 days, like days, so that you can quit production on something that is just not going to sell when it hits the market. And then finally, making sure that you've got different structures on how that land is capitalized, how expenses are capitalized or expensed. You need to get creative on how all of that works. So really, in conclusion, if you are thinking as a vintner that this will pass, for some of you, that may actually absolutely be the case. For some of you, especially selling high-end vintages, for sure. You might be able to weather this pretty easily because people like me and Gen X and folks who are into wine as millennials will pick up that slack. And for you, that might not make that big of a difference. But for most vintners, or at least a lot of them, you need to be thinking about innovating your way out of this. You will never cut your way out of this. So again, go to jasonvoiovich.com, click on time setting, read the full essay, and comment. Reach out to me. If you're a grower, you're a vintner, and you have questions about this, let's talk about it. Maybe we'll get on YouTube and do a little interview and try to figure this thing out together, because I love wine, I love the Napa Valley, and I want to see it be successful for the next 50 years, not just the last 50. That's it for today. See you on the next one.